Okay, welcome to the second module for EMR 501, Theory and Practice of Reading. My name is Dr. Walsh-Moorman, and we're going to be looking today at transactional theory of reading, in part because I think we can see how this is really an important theory that has a lot of influence for us and also brings us some interesting challenges in today's world. Okay, so what I want to begin with is a metaphor that was used by the person who is credited with founding this theory of transactional theory of reading, Louise Rosenblatt. In her book, The Reader, the Text, and the Poem, theorist Rosenblatt likened theories of literature to a stage with a spotlight. At different times in history, she argued, the spotlight would focus on different elements. Rosenblatt writes, I find it helpful to visualize a little scene. On a darkened stage, I see figures of the author, the reader, with a book, the text of the poem or the play or a novel between them. The spotlight focuses on one of them so brightly that the others fade into invisibility. Rosenblatt goes on to argue that throughout the centuries, the bright light has generally illuminated the book or the author. The reader, she says, has generally remained invisible. Traditionally, scholars and academics were concerned with how the text reflected life. This was the era of classical literature, and good literature was considered to talk about some kind of universal human truth, talking about things like the human experience. The writer, his context, his style, his own story, those were not relevant. What mattered was the relationship between life and literature. What then happened was the poet, and I have a picture of my favorite poet, Maya Angelou, because why not? Towards the end of the 18th century, Rosenblatt argues, the poet and the author emerges into visibility. And so now suddenly the poet's story, their context, their style, that becomes important. And so we have, author studies. This is, we're starting to see some of the romantic poets and Blake and Wordsworth, and there's just a much stronger emphasis on understanding the context that the writer was writing about. But there was never any time where we were looking at the author. What happens then in the classroom, that the classroom then, the teaching of reading becomes the teaching of biography of the times of the author, or a document of literary movements and styles and genres. It becomes very removed from the reader himself. So as teachers, we focus on text structures, on devices, on poetic styles. We're probably all guilty of this, or not guilty of it. We'll probably recognize ourselves in this. The reader, it seemed, was left to play the role of the eavesdropper. Art for art's sake became the cry of people who thought that we should look at, how poems and literature reflect the times of the writer. The other response to that on the other end is the text alone. Let's look just at the text. But both of these, while they became kind of mantras for how to teach literature, both of these kind of really did not have a lot to say about the reader himself. So Rosenblatt was unhappy. She began to say, well, where is the reader in this? And she wanted to explore that. So as part of her study, she used her college-age students. And many of her students were actually advanced English majors. So these were very well-trained college-age students. And she wanted to see how they would make sense of an unfamiliar text. So she handed them this quatrain, which was written by Robert Frost. She did not tell them it was written by Robert Frost in case they had any knowledge of Robert Frost. And that might kind of sort of influence the interpretation that they start to make. She gave them no discussion, and the only instruction she gave them was to ask them to jot down whatever ideas came to them as they read. What Rosenblatt noted after she was looking at literally hundreds and hundreds of responses like this, what she noted was that even these trained college students were only giving rudimentary literary responses. They really weren't looking at things like meter and rhythm and things like that. Instead, they were creating context or a framework into which they would find meaning for the lines. Comments would speculate if it was part of a conversation or an internal dialogue. Students would speculate who might be conversing. Some were determining what genre the lines came from. Is this a play? Is it a poem? But most of our students reevaluated when they got to the third line. So let me put the third line up here. This third line became problematic for some of the students, and she was interested to see how that third line, when it became problematic, what students did. In this line, students began to have to adapt, many students, not all of them, but many students began to have to adapt their framework. If they had decided this was a conversation between a director and a performer for a beginning, say in the first two lines, the third line caused them to dig back in to the text, to draw back onto their knowledge and to make connections to other readings. Perhaps something else they read where they knew that, they knew the sun was probably symbolic, and so they began to explore what some symbols for the sun might be. So what she saw was that third line helped her really kind of open up a window into the process that her students were going into making meaning. So she had two important takeaways that she came up with. The first one was that the reader was active. The reader had to draw on his past experiences with the verbal symbols. It wasn't just the text, and it wasn't just what he had learned about the genre, so it wasn't just academic knowledge. It was also their experiences. He had to select from a variety of possible interpretations that he considered. He would need to reinterpret if he found something that kind of challenged his first interpretation. And he was searching for a synthesizing element to bring himself and the text together, whether that be a context, this is a conversation, a meaning, this is about the brevity of life, whatever it might be. They wanted some kind of synthesizing framework that then allowed them to interpret the text. The other takeaway that she came up with was that the reader was not only paying attention to external, but also to internal knowledge. The learner was not paying attention to what the signs pointed to in the external, meaning like the reference, meaning like they didn't just look at a literal interpretation or an academic interpretation of the text. The reader was also paying attention to how the images, what images the text kind of invoked in them, brought to mind, what feelings and attitudes and associations were brought there. Essentially, they were looking at themselves personally and their own personalities. The reader's attention to the text activated certain elements in his past experiences. External references and internal responses is the phrase that she gave that has become linked to the text. Meaning emerges from a network of relationships of the things symbolized as he senses them. Thus, built in the meaning making that a reader employs in this is his particular worldview of the reader himself. So, what she began to consider is that we should look at reading as an event, right? The poem then, or the literature, the nonfiction, becomes an event that is the coming together of the reader and the text. And we need to look at that as a much more dynamic process. And so that's how she came up with this idea of reading as a delicate transaction between what is written on the page and what knowledge, experiences, and perspective the reader brings to those words. Another example she brought, and I have here, I won't play this for you, it's 24 minutes long, but I have here a picture of probably the only famous cellist I know, Yo-Yo Ma. But one of the questions that she asks, if we think of, if we look at it just, what is the text, just the decoding, what does it actually say? It would be like thinking that music only matters, the notes only matter in music. And if that was true, if the written notes were all that mattered, what would distinguish a performance by Yo-Yo Ma from, say, one at the Lakeland Civic Orchestra? It is the personality of the performer that matters. And with reading, it is the personality of the reader that matters. So much like a musician is interpreting the music, the reader is interpreting the text. So I like that a lot. She also talks a lot about this idea of readers are trained to look at their reading from two different stances. The first stance, which is by far the most common, especially in schools, is the stance where they read to gather information from the text. We need to be careful that we are not just asking the students to take afferent stances. While this is important, obviously, this is not the only purpose in reading, because she said also they need to look at it from an aesthetic, which is to enjoy the characteristics. So readers are trained to look at something, to to gather information, even just literature, like just to get the right answer to questions. That becomes problematic because the real transaction happens at the aesthetic stance, because in the aesthetic stance, what is beautiful is open to interpretation and experience. All right, before we move on today, I just wanted to take a quick note and just explain that Rosenblatt's theory of reading has been used to inform a transactional theory of writing that essentially sees tension between the sign system, written language, that a writer must use to convey personal ideas and experiences. And so, just so that you know, transactional theory helps us to understand the decoding, the reading, but it also helps us to understand why some students struggle with encoding or writing. Okay, so if I were to look at a classroom that has transactional theory as kind of a pivot point, what are some of the things I might find? I might find a teacher asking the students to make predictions of the text, to draw on their experiences and make predictions of the text. I might see her activating their prior knowledge. Think, pair, share activities, allowing students to share freely about their interpretations as they're emerging and their connections that they're making. I might ask them to annotate or track their thinking as they read. I might ask them to question the text, and I might allow them to respond to the text in other sign systems, such as visually draw a response to the text or musically. The challenge then, and this is just a challenge, I don't have an answer for you because that's the whole point of this class, but how can we use our knowledge of reader response theory to help prepare our students in this age of Ohio New Learning Standards? So I have here a copy of a typical question from the 5th grade ELA section, and you can see, that these questions are asking things like, what is the function of a word phrase in paragraph 3? So how do we navigate between what we know about the personal nature of reading and what we know about the sort of academic demands of reading? Okay. So this week's assignment that I'm going to be asking you to do is I've got the lenses in reading. We're going to be reading this one more week. We're going to be looking at this work. And what I want you to do is read chapters 8 and 9 in there. I'm going to have you download the same Think in Threes. If you made your own modified graphic organizer, that is fine. I just want those same 3 sections identified in there. I'm just trying to find ways to allow you to respond to the reading in a way that doesn't always have us going onto the discussion board, because I know that can get tiresome for you. I would like to point out to you that next week I'm going to need you to get a copy of Making Literacy Real for the next learning module, because we're going to be getting that. All right. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next learning module. Have a good day.